Good evening. Welcome to Reparations, Unpacking the Meaning. I am Veronica Abney of the Temple Emanuel of Beverly Hills Jews of Color Task Force. Our congregation is honored to present this event with the Union for Reform Judaism and Temple Sinai of Washington, D.C. You may remember at the last biennial, we as the Reform Movement passed a resolution affirming the need to study reparations. In addition to advocating for a federal commission to explore these issues, it affirmed that our congregations need to be proactive and take active steps to redress the destructive effects of historic and ongoing systemic racism, including through education and conversations within our congregations. As part of that effort, we are kicking off a three-part series to bolster our understanding of reparations. Today's conversation will focus on unpacking the term itself, what it means, what historical examples for different populations have entailed, and how that conversation is taking shape today with regard to descendants of slaves in the United States. I would like to turn it over to Yolanda Savage-Narva, the URJ's Director of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, who will be leading our conversation to welcome and introduce our featured speaker for tonight's program.
Thank you so much, Veronica, for the work you're doing as a member of the Jews of Color Task Force at Temple Emanuel, and for kicking us off this evening. So I'm Yolanda, and I am the Director of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the URJ. I live in Washington, D.C. on Pamunkey, Piscataway, and Anacostan tribal land, and I am very grateful to share this space with you this evening, and for some of you this afternoon if you're on the West Coast, and to be in dialogue with Professor Darin Johnson, who I will introduce shortly. So in December of 2019, the last time we all gathered together physically in one space at the biennial in Chicago, Veronica mentioned, the Reform Movement passed a resolution on reparations. And so this was a pivotal moment, I think, for all of us at this meeting. I'm going to be honest, we didn't get a unanimous vote on this. There were some people who did not support this resolution. And while that was disappointing at the time, I think that we have an opportunity to really shine the light on what reparations means and how we can move forward. So to be clear, the resolution does not define what form reparations should take. Instead, just like the congressional legislation calling for a committee to study and develop proposals, this is what the resolution endorses as well. And so the main foundation of the why of this resolution for the Reform Movement really goes back to text and Talmud. And at the beginning of the resolution, this is what's there. It says, in the Talmud, we learn that all people are descended from a single person, so that no person can say, my ancestor is greater than yours. God created humanity from the four corners of the earth: yellow clay and white sand, black loam and red soil. Therefore, the earth can declare to no part of humanity that it does not belong here, that this soil is not their rightful home. Our Jewish texts are clear on the importance of restitution for wrongs committed. The rabbis understood that the victim of a crime was made whole by financial repayment for damages done. And so with that, we want to dive into the discussion around reparations. And we are going to focus on understanding what reparations really are and the multiple ways they can be implemented. And along the way, I'll share different parts and excerpts of the resolution with you as well. So I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing our guest speaker, Professor Darin Johnson, who brings a wealth of knowledge to this subject. Darin Johnson is an associate professor at the Howard University School of Law. Professor Johnson received his BA from Yale College and his JD from Harvard Law School. At Harvard Law School, he was an executive editor of the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. Professor Johnson's research interests include constitutional reform, reconciliation, and the rule of law in post-conflict and transitioning states. Professor Johnson provides legal advice on matters of public international law and the rule of law in post-conflict, transitioning, and developing countries through his work as a senior peace fellow with the Public International Law and Policy Group and his consultancy work. Much of this work deals with very real and practical questions about reparations. So we will hear a brief presentation from Professor Johnson before he and I engage in discussion. And we will then open the conversation to get some of your questions in the chat. And so make sure you send those to Rabbi Sarah Basson as they come up. And Professor Johnson, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Let me first thank you, Rabbi Sarah Basson, Dr. Veronica Abney, the Jews of Color Task Force, the Temple of Emanuel, Beverly Hills, Temple Sinai of DC, and the Union for Reform Judaism for inviting me to participate in this very important conversation. I'd like to begin our conversation by sharing some thoughts about the broader topic of reparations, what they are, how they can be achieved, and to explore these concepts through historic and present day examples in the African-American movement for reparations. Now, in terms of definition, reparations is commonly defined as the making of amends for a wrong done by paying money or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. But to better understand the meaning of the term reparations, I like to think about reparations in terms of three broad questions. First, what is owed to whom, which includes the sub-questions. What was the harm? Who was it committed against? And who will be the recipient of reparations? And will those reparations be individual or group-based? The second broad question that I like to think about is what is the vehicle for the payment of reparations? Are they awarded by political agreement, by judicial fiat, or is there some other voluntary arrangement? And finally, the third broad question I think about in understanding the meaning of reparations is what form should the reparations take? That can include forms such as compensatory damages, restoration of property. Are we discussing financial payments? Or are we looking at something more systemic, some type of institutional reform that helps to make communities whole? Now, in the traditional understanding of the term, we've seen that reparations have been awarded, right, in the form of money by those harmed, either by a state government or by those within a government or within a society that are serious human rights abusers. The quintessential example that we can think about, of course, are the payments made from the government of Germany to the government of Israel following World War II. I know, Yolanda, that you'll touch more on that a bit later in our conversation. Other examples include Japanese payments to so-called Korean comfort women from World War II, as well as US congressional payments to Japanese Americans who were forcibly interned in World War II. Now, I'd like to share my screen. And so what I'd like to now turn to is a discussion, right, of the reparations movement in terms of African Americans in the United States. So when we think about the African American community, right, we know that human rights abuses have included over 250 years of chattel slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, and ongoing systemic discrimination. So when we think about reparations, it's very difficult to quantify the massive economic and psychic effect and material impact that these abuses have had on the African-American community. What dollar figure can one actually place on these atrocity crimes? Reparations in the African-American context also raises difficult questions, such as who should be the recipient of reparations? Should the recipients be descendants of enslaved peoples, descendants of those impacted by segregation, all Black Americans? Should it include recent African and Caribbean immigrants who are impacted by the legacies of systemic discrimination and present-day discrimination? And as we have this conversation, are we talking about individual claimants, or are we talking about group-based remedies? And again, what form will the remedies take? A check, a program, or some other form of systematized investment? Now, in terms of the African-American movement for reparations, I should first note that there have been several waves of this ongoing conversation about reparations in African-American context. Now, the waves can be typified by a few different key moments, right, where this conversation was particularly emphasized by African-American leaders. Largely, the conversation was held following the Civil War, following emancipation. Another wave occurred during what is known as the Great Black Migration North, right, as formerly enslaved people moved north and west for new opportunities. The conversation was again held as well during World War II, as well as during the Civil Rights era. And during each of these periods, African-American leaders attempted to get the US government to make widespread and tangible investments in the Black community as a whole in recompense for slavery and state oppression. But unfortunately, that broad objective was never achieved. Now, I would posit today that there is a new wave of reparations activism that actually began, reparations activism in the African-American community, that actually began in the early 21st century, which in my view has been continued and is being renewed today. So in this latest wave, in the early 2000s, several African-American thought leaders and scholars, such as my former professor and mentor, Professor Charles Ogletree at Harvard Law School, had a conversation about reparations. Now, this conversation largely arose out of a book published by Trans-Africa founder Randall Robinson. For those of you that may or may not know, Trans-Africa, it was a think tank founded by Randall Robinson that was focused on support that the African-American community could have to the continent of Africa through its works. And so as someone who was a leader in civil rights and a leader in the apartheid movement, Randall Robinson turned his conversation towards the discussion of reparations in the US. And he published a book called The Debt: What America Owes to Blacks. And the discussion, again, centered around the three questions that I started with. So on that first question, what is owed, right? What is owed to the African-American community? As I mentioned before, it's very difficult, right, to quantify the level of harm that has accrued to the community and to come up with a dollar figure. But there have been those who have attempted to do so. So during this most recent wave of reparations activism, Tulane professor Robert Wesley attempted to do just that, right? He attempted to quantify the economic impact of slavery and segregation on the collective descendants of formerly enslaved people. So Professor Wesley pulled together several statistics across several different sectors. I'm going to focus on one alone. So in the area of housing, Professor Wesley determined that decades of discriminatory housing policies, racially restricted covenants, backed by Federal Housing Administration discriminatory lending practices, had cost an entire generation of African Americans $93 billion, right? So $93 billion lost in potential housing equity that was never held by the community. So $93 billion in one sector alone, lost from discriminatory practices. So when we start to look at quantifying the amount of economic harm that's been caused by slavery, segregation and ongoing discrimination, we then need to turn to the question, right, once we've identified that something is owed, of what vehicle for delivery is appropriate, right? And as I mentioned before, some of the most common vehicles are political agreements, such as legislation or a treaty, or by judicial fiat, right? And so many times these political agreements arise out of collective moral outrage, right? So I mentioned the agreement between Germany and Israel that followed World War II, right? Out of that agreement, that treaty between Germany and Israel, Germany passed a law which was roughly translated to a reparations law, or a making good again law, that among other things paid $1 billion to Israel for crimes committed by the Third Reich. Now, upon completion of the treaty, then Israel Prime Minister Ben-Gurion stated that for the first time, as a result of moral pressure, a great state has paid compensation to victims of massive human rights abuses. And you'll see time and time again through the examples that I give, that it's actually that movement, that societal pressure, that moral outrage, which has led to every reparations reform or reparations actualization that we've seen. So I'd now like to turn to the US context, right, where we have an example of reparations as well. So in the United States, in 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 to provide reparations to Japanese Americans who had been interned during World War II. Many of you will know that during World War II, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly interned for no other reason than the fact that they were of Japanese descent, and we happened to be at war with Japan. And so after 40 years of pressure, Congress awarded reparations to victims of that internment on a widespread bipartisan basis. So specific monetary compensation was awarded to these internees. Now, interestingly enough, 1 year after this bill was passed, for the very first time, Congressman Conyers, an African-American congressman, passed or proposed H.R. Bill 40, which called for a commission to investigate how the US government has benefited from slavery and to make recommendations for recompense for those violations. It closely mirrored, right, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And so Congressman Conyers first put forward that bill in 1989, and in the last 30 years, it has not moved out of committee until recently. And I'm going to turn to that at the end of my remarks. Now, I want to return to this discussion of reparations in the United States. Now, in the African-American movement for reparations, there hasn't been much success at the national level historically, but in the early 2000s, in the latest wave of reparations activism, there were a few states and municipalities that had awarded different types of reparations to the African-American community. And I want to turn to one of those examples. So in 2003, the state of Florida passed legislation to recompense the victims of the Rosewood Massacre. So the Rosewood Massacre, I want to give some background on. So Rosewood is a community, was an affluent African-American community in Florida that was flourishing in the early 20th century. But in 1923, during one of the many periods of significant racial tension, the community was completely destroyed by a white lynch mob. Over the course of 1 week, 6 people were killed, survivors were driven into swamps, and the entire community was destroyed. And as a result of that violence, right, 70 years later, after much advocacy, in 1994, the Florida governor signed a bill that provided $2 million in reparations to the surviving victims and the descendants of those killed in the Rosewood Massacre. Now, some of you may know about the Rosewood Massacre from history. Some others of you may know about it from the film written in the 1990s by John Singleton of the same name, right? And so that film helped to popularize the Rosewood Massacre. Now, turning turning back in time a bit, right, going back to immediately following the Civil War, right, there have been continued calls for reparations from the US government by African-American leaders. And so interestingly enough, following the Civil War, President Lincoln supported a plan that would have provided reparations and payments, but to former slave owners, right? And this would have been reparations for the loss of their human property. Now, Lincoln's successor, President Johnson, vetoed a bill that actually would have included reparations for the formerly enslaved. And despite the best efforts of African-American leaders and a progressive Congress at that time, reparations legislation was not passed, right? And so in short, coming out of the Civil War, the proverbial 40 acres and a mule that had been promised to African Americans by General Sherman, specifically to slaves who would rise up and fight with the Union during the Civil War, that 40 acres and a mule never came to pass, right? So I want to now turn to the second type of reparations that I mentioned before, and that's reparations by judicial fiat. So we did see in the early 2000s significant attempts at reparations by Professor Ogletree and other attorneys. Litigation was brought in several states, and in particular, litigation was brought around the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, right? So very similar to the massacre of Rosewood in the early 1900s, the Greenwood neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was known as Black Wall Street, was a success story, right? It was a very successful African-American community, very self-reliant, as many communities were at the time, by necessity. But just like in Rosewood, the Greenwood community was subjected to violence from a white mob. So over the course of one day, the entire community was destroyed. 300 African Americans were killed. The National Guard was called in, but actually when it was called in, it removed African Americans from Greenwood. And as a result, the empty buildings, over 1,200 of them were destroyed, resulting in over $20 million in property damage in 2003 dollars, right? So just in one day, an entire community was destroyed. So right away, following the Tulsa massacre, African-American leaders and others advocated for reparations. But it wasn't until the early 2000s, right, that Professor Ogletree took up the cause. So on behalf of 130 survivors, Professor Ogletree sued on their behalf, right? He pulled together an all-star team of lawyers and scholars who had a great evidentiary record, and they filed litigation in US court. But unfortunately, the case was not successful at the lower courts, and the Supreme Court denied certiorari, meaning it would not review the case. That allowed for the case to be brought at the international level in the Inter-American Court for Human Rights. And although there was a very impressive record, and although there was opportunity for the very first time for the survivors of Oklahoma, the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre, to put their stories on record, the commission actually decided not to rule on the case. There are many that have speculated that this was for diplomatic reasons, that the record was so strong that there may have been some members of the commission that didn't want to find against the United States. So they opted not to decide the case. So when we think about this effort, right, for reparations for judicial fiat, we find that in terms of using the courts, there are a lot of barriers, right, to reparations through the courts, right? There are what is known as justiciability barriers, right? There are challenges of standing, right? Who has the right to sue, sovereign immunity, right? Protection of the US government, and issues of statutes of limitation. So although the Tulsa litigation was not successful in terms of getting reparations, right? It did serve to give the survivors of the massacre an opportunity in the Inter-American Commission to have their voices heard, right? And that brings us to the realization of what reparations are intended to do, right? Reparations are about remuneration, but they're also about collective acknowledgement and responsibility for past harms. And so this brings us to the current moment, right? And so in the current moment, right, we actually see a lot of reparations activism taking place at the local level, right? And this activism is the result of a number of circumstances, right? Largely, it's being driven by young activists, right? Young African-American activists that are demanding reform and change. And so in two of these examples, we see changes being made at the university level, right? So in recent years, we've seen that institutions like Georgetown have created reparations funds. And so now Georgetown actually provides scholarships to the descendants of enslaved persons that early leaders at Georgetown owned and sold. And then at Brown University, right, in response to a decades-old report that published the university's ties to slavery, Brown University undergrads voted in support of reparations for descendants of enslaved people. The referendum calls for preferential enrollment for individuals identified as directly tied to descendants of enslaved people and direct commitment of money to them as well, right? The referendum also asked for targeted investment in high schools in the area with large Black populations and for partnerships with colleges and universities in the South. I want to quickly turn to a couple of other recent changes. So in Virginia, just this past month on April 1st, the Virginia governor signed the Enslaved Ancestors College Access Scholarship Memorial Program. So this law requires that the five public universities in Virginia identify enslaved people who work for the university and to memorialize those individuals, and also that they provide a tangible benefit such as college scholarships or community-based economic development programs to people or communities with a demonstrated historic tie to slavery with the aim of empowering those communities. We also have seen efforts at the within religious communities, right? And so I just want to quickly flag one, the Minnesota Council of Churches, which consists of 25 Christian denominations, has decided that as a result of historic injustices against the Native American, African American community, to launch a first of its kind truth and reparations initiative, engaging all of its denominations. The initiative envisions a 10-year undertaking, which will be very diverse. It's modeled on the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation process. It's based in part, it's based in Minneapolis, where the police killing of George Floyd sparked global uprisings related to that racial injustice. And it also has resulted in a significant pledge from its diocese in Texas alone, which announced in February that it would allocate $13 million to long-term programs benefiting African Americans. And so finally, that brings us to the legislative bill that I mentioned before that was introduced in 1989. So just last month in April, for the very first time in 32 years, that bill was passed out of congressional committee, right? It was passed out of the Judiciary Committee, and now it will have the opportunity for a vote in Congress. President Biden has already signaled that he will sign the law. And so we just need to see if it will make its way through the Senate. But again, the bill itself calls for the establishment of a commission to examine slavery and discrimination from 1619 to the present, and a commission that will recommend ways to educate Americans about its findings and appropriate remedies. So I will stop my initial remarks there, and I'm very excited to now move into a conversation with Yolanda.
First, Darin, I just have to say, Professor Johnson, Darin, thank you so much for such a powerful and informative presentation. I know I learned a lot, specifically around the newer initiatives that are going on and people doing this in partnership with one another. And I think that's really powerful and promising. So if I could just pivot just for a moment, because you mentioned a couple of things that I would love to have the opportunity to dive deeper into. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the Jewish example that we have in post-Holocaust reparations for a little bit, and read this excerpt, and we can, maybe have a bit of a discussion about it if you'd like to do that. So in 1951, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, committed to paying moral and material indemnity for the unspeakable crimes committed in the name of the German people during World War II. The following year, the government signed a set of reparations agreements with Israel and an umbrella group of advocates known as the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, or Claims Conference. And then over the next 20 years, Germany committed to compensating other countries, Jewish and non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and former forced laborers. While it's difficult to estimate the exact amount of money in today's dollars that was paid in dollars over time, Germany says that it has distributed over $91.9 billion. And it's interesting that you talked about around $93 billion for what they are estimating is owed to, or at least the start, for enslaved Africans in the United States. And so I read that excerpt because I think it's very important to understand how all of that happened and the amount of money that has been paid to date. And then there's another piece that I'd like to read and then get your comments or feedback on. And I find this very compelling. Actually, it was written in 1985, but it's still very important today. And German President Richard von Weizsäcker made the case for intergenerational responsibility and solidarity in a speech that he gave. And he said this: the vast majority of today's population were either children then or had not been born, but their forefathers have left them a grave legacy. All of us, whether guilty or not, whether old or young, must accept the past. We are all affected by its consequences and liable for it.
Very, very powerful words. So Yolanda, in that context, I'd love to ask you a question about what's actually happening within congregations around reparations. Are congregations having this conversation? What does it look like on the ground?
It's a good question. And I've started doing research on it. I will mention that what we're doing today and what we're doing on May 16th and the 23rd is something that's very powerful. And that's being honestly spearheaded by two congregations, Temple Emanuel of Beverly Hills and Temple Sinai of DC. And just bringing people together to start this conversation is very important. But there are some other things that have happened also. So I was looking through to find what's gone on around reparations and congregations and synagogues. And I found Rabbi Seth Limmer's Kol Nidre speech from last year. And I'm only going to pull a couple of excerpts from it, but I think it's really foundational to what we're talking about and the myriad ways that I think congregations and synagogues can get involved and start having these conversations in their congregations. So this is just a piece of the Kol Nidre speech. What does it mean to remove the foundational beam of racism from the palace of American life and culture? What might reparations mean in religious terms? Our sage Samuel suggests we might have to strip America to the studs. Metaphorically, to remove the racist beams literally built into our White House by enslaved human beings in a fashion that informs our modern situation. Judaism's greatest rabbi, Hillel and Shammai, debate whether such a radical reconstruction is literal or figurative. Discussing what happens with the stolen beam built into a foundation Shammai, echoing Samuel, teaches that the entire building should be destroyed and the beam returned to its owners. Hillel, however, says that the building can stand with stolen beam in place, adding that only the value of the beam needs to be repaid to the injured party. What divides Judaism's two greatest teachers is the best way to atone for a foundation built upon theft and deceit. Do we remove the foundational beam or merely make fiscal restitution? Either way, Hillel and Shammai agree about the central obligation that reparations are necessary. Reparations are necessary. I know some people wonder if it really matters that America was built on rotten timbers, if enslaved human beings built our White House, since that was all ancient history. But we can no longer avoid beholding our present reality. American racism has decimated Black wealth, underfunded Black communities, incarcerated Black bodies, and so much more. We have a lot of atoning, repentance, teshuvah, turning, and reparations to make for our toxic, systemic, and institutional racisms. So that's basically an excerpt from the Kol Nidre speech. And I don't have specific congregations that are doing work, but I know that the conversations are happening, and that's one illustration of that. So, and I know I'm looking at our time too. I have a couple of other examples of some institutions that are doing work in reparations, but we may be able to get to that through our Q&A.
Wonderful. So maybe as a closing question, Yolanda, I could ask you before we go to Q&A, what's next? So these conversations are happening. Where do you see them going?
Oh, it's a really good question, Professor Johnson. So I really would like to have an opportunity to talk more with the folks in the congregations and in our communities about what reparations questions they have, to really see if this is something that the Jewish community can get behind. We have our resolution that was passed at the biennial in December of 2019. And it really sets the foundation for learning and growing and supporting reparations. And I know you'll touch on this a little later, but there's movement. There's real movement around this issue. I've kind of coined the term big R, little r. While I know that, you know, the federal response to reparations may be further off, there are opportunities for local communities, for congregations, for groups to come together to really at least examine and study what reparations could look like for the descendants of enslaved Africans.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this first conversation. And I'll look very much with you responding to questions from our audience here today.
Yes, I am too. And I'm checking it out now to see if any questions have come in. Let's see. Rabbi Basson, do we have any questions at this point?
We do. On the Google Doc, the first one that has come up is, how can I get involved in advancing reparations? What is the best way to help pass HR 40? What can we do?
So, you know, I'm happy to take a stab at that second part. What can you do to help pass HR 40? You know, I think we should view this as any other effort in which we want to get Congress to pass legislation, and that's to reach out to your congressperson, right? To reach out to them, to let them know that you support HR 40, to let them know why you support HR 40. Now that it has passed out of committee, it will receive a vote in Congress, and it looks like it will pass this current Congress. So I think efforts also should be directed at your senator, right? Because that's where I think there's really going to be a question of whether the legislation will get supported. But if we can get 51 senators, President Biden has said that he'll sign the bill. So now is the time to advocate, to reach out, and to speak to your elected representatives.
Excellent. So I'm able to view the questions that are coming in. And so we didn't touch on this, kind of the governmental response of to reparations, specifically Evanston, Illinois. And so do you have anything that you want to talk about related to what's going on in Evanston? And, you know, are these things that can be replicated?
I will defer on speaking about the specifics of the Evanston program, but what I would say is that absolutely, right, these bills could be replicated. You saw that in my remarks. I did spend some time talking about the recent legislation passed in Virginia. There have been other municipal bills in addition to Evanston. There have historically been municipal efforts in Chicago, as well as in Oklahoma. And so what I would say is, yes, advocacy at the national level is important, but so is advocacy at the state level, right? So we've seen that we've had reparations legislation passed in Virginia. I mentioned the reparations legislation that was passed in Florida. Similar initiatives can be passed at the state level and the municipal level. And what's interesting about these local efforts is they're often tied directly to, right, the abuses that have occurred in particular communities, which is why they can be particularly impactful. And oftentimes, as we've seen, there has been greater success at the local level. The national level has taken quite some time.
Yeah, I agree. So, Professor Johnson, this question is kind of around housing reparations. And, you know, it's interesting because I know that that's also the foundational piece for Evanston, but this is a little bit more broad around housing. And it says, what can be done to provide appropriate housing reparations, if there's such a thing? It seems to me that one of the most important things is for individuals to get to know individuals of different colors and religions. That seems to mean that integrated housing must be a part of any reparations or other improvements in our society.
You know, that's a great question, right? Particularly when we think about, well, what is the harm, right? And so when we look at the housing context, which I referred to a bit in our remarks, right? The harm was redlining, right? Racially restrictive covenants, the denial of access to living in communities of one's choice, and also denial of access to mortgages, right? And so it's these collective state-backed efforts, right? Because remember, these racially restrictive covenants were supported, local jurisdictions supported by the courts, and discriminatory mortgage lending, right, was backed by the Federal Housing Administration, right? So there's clear government state action, which I think does call for a clear government response. And so I think I'm intrigued that the person that asked the question included not only access to housing, but this idea of integrated housing, right? And the importance of having integrated communities, right? And we look at the original harm, which was kind of this forced separation and denial of freedom of movement and freedom to live where one would choose. Then I think it's very creative, right, to think that integration and freedom of access should be part of the solution. So I think that's a very insightful comment, and I think very accurate.
Yeah, I would agree. That makes me think about creativity. There is a nonprofit that has started setting itself up as kind of a base for funds around reparations. And it's actually located in Denver, Colorado. And I'm looking for my notes on it. I have several pages of notes here that I'm taking and what have you, but it's a really creative way to think about reparations. And this is a woman who said that she was looking through her parents' belongings at one point, and she found a booklet that showed that her family owned slaves in Mississippi. And she took it upon herself to try to do something about that. And she created this nonprofit, and she has different funds set up where people who are on their own racial journey that wants to give to people who have been disenfranchised, they can go into this organization and give funds, and then she disseminates the funds to different groups throughout the country. It's really an interesting way to think about this.
Absolutely. And Yolanda, if I could add another thought, when we think about reparations, right, we think about what the broader goal is of reparations, and it's to make, individuals and communities whole. And when I think about this in kind of the international context, transitional justice, reparations is one of many tools, right, to bring people whole, right? So it's reparations, it's also accountability, right? It's justice, it's memorialization, it's remembering and acknowledging what has happened. And so I wanted to acknowledge the work that many in our community have been doing, right, in that space. And so I need to, of course, acknowledge the great work that's being done by Brian Stevenson, author of Just Mercy. He has, in Birmingham, Alabama, he has created the Peace and Justice Museum, which is the first in US history memorial that acknowledges our history of lynching, right? And it acknowledges that pain, and it makes it very present so that we can confront it, right? And so that memorialization is also part of this broader conversation. And that's why I'm also so intrigued to see that, in part out of the sadness of George Floyd's death and the pain of his death, that we see that this local congregation of churches in Minnesota has now decided to have a truth and reconciliation process modeled on South Africa for the local community, which has suffered from systemic racism, police violence, and other ills, as a means of attempting to struggle with these issues and to move ahead. So reparations is part of this broader whole, right, of how do we make communities and individuals whole.
Yeah, I agree that there are many avenues that we need to take, and reparations is one of them. So, Professor Johnson, I have to tell you, the questions are coming everywhere. I'm trying to, we probably could spend another hour going through the questions, but here's one. Is there, do you have any reaction to the recent reparations program instituted in Evanston, Illinois? That one came in. So if reparations are only aimed at descendants of slaves, what happens to other Blacks in America who have been negatively impacted by discrimination and racist policies, but who aren't descendants of slaves?
So I'm happy to tackle this. I touched on it in my remarks. That's one of the questions, right, that sometimes comes up in conversations of reparations. I think one of the things that we need to return to are first principles, right? Kind of the three questions that I originally asked, right? So who has been harmed, right? And thinking about who the particular recipient is, what mechanism is being used to pursue the reparations program, and what form does it take? And so when I think about this question, I often think about, maybe starting with the third question: what form does it take, right? And so if we're talking about, institutional reform, right? So I talked about the most recent wave of reparations activism, African-American community, the wave that I signaled as beginning in the early 21st century. One of my former professors and mentors, Charles Ogletree, was very active in that process. And so when we would have conversations, and those in the community would have conversations about reparations, right, I always found that his view was very interesting, right? His view was that he's not necessarily advocating for a specific check going out to individuals, right? He thought of reparations as widespread historic investments in institutions, right, that benefit communities that have been long harmed by the legacies of discrimination, right? Whether those investments are for business development, educational institutions, access to college. I think his view was kind of a rising tide lifts all ships, right? So if you're targeting your investments at African-American communities, yes, of course, others within those communities will also benefit who may not themselves have been descendants of the enslaved, but you also will find individuals in that community who are impacted by the legacies of slavery and systemic discrimination. And so it is a very active debate, right? You will, when you move into the reparations space and you see the debates within the movement, there are some, right, that advocate for specific reparations for those who are descendant from slaves. But many, I think, take a more holistic view, realizing that the legacies of discrimination are still impacting many communities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Here's one. And I think we are getting to this. This is a pretty comprehensive question, Professor Johnson. So this may be our last one, but we definitely have all of these recorded, and hopefully we'll have a chance to have more of a dialogue with everyone around reparations. So this question says, there are a number of different approaches of how much money, we talked about this. This can take different forms, but if we're thinking specifically about money should be awarded as reparations, how can there be a meeting of the minds to arrive at a number?
Yeah, that's therein lies the rub, right? I don't even think, quite frankly, personally, I don't think that there is a number big enough, right, to recompense for 250 years of chattel slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, right? So let's just start there. I don't think there's any number that's big enough to recompense. But, right, there has been some work done in this area, right? I mentioned Professor Wesley, who's done a lot of work on the financial and economic impact of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. And I mentioned one, the $93 billion in lost equity, right? Lost housing equity that a generation of African Americans faced as a result of government policy, right? And so you can look across those sectors and come up with numbers, and then maybe make the decision that you might have a similar level of investment through various programs into communities that have been discriminated against. I tend personally to think about reparations, at least at the national level, from a programmatic sense, right? I think of it in terms of investments and programs, but we know that there are also very localized reparations programs like the Georgetown program or Virginia, where the reparations are being targeted specifically to those who are descended from the enslaved people that were harmed by those institutions. And so I think there's room for both, right? Thinking about this nationally, and also thinking about it individually, where it's a little easier, maybe not easier, but maybe the specific benefits accruing to individuals are a little more clear.
Right. And I think, you were really spot on with that. There's no amount of money for any of the harm and the dehumanization that many groups have faced over the years to remedy that. There's just no way to do that. What this is, and you mentioned this, is that there's reparations, there's truth and reconciliation. There are a lot of pieces of, of the pie that needs to be part of the conversation and implemented in order for people to feel some sense of, being taken care of in a way. And so I think that's a really important point. There's just no amount of money. There is one more that, go ahead.
Yolanda, if I could maybe just make a comment, maybe a comment signaling my optimism. Right, I can remember being, in college in the 90s and early 2000s, and I remember where the topic of reparations was a political football. It was almost like a political third rail, right? And there was a fear within, certain political parties about even mentioning reparations, and the thought that would be, would lose votes. And it's amazing to me how 20 years on, right, there's a much broader collective conversation in America right now about reparations. And I think that owes in no small part to the fact that we're in a period of very active youth activism around police violence, right? And I think that conversation has really, and what we've seen, right, with the health crisis through COVID, I think it's
Right.
I think it's made clear to many Americans in a very tangible way, right? The inequalities that exist, the systemic violence that's still occurring that maybe folks weren't as aware of, right? Pre-social media and pre these new movements. And so I think that's created space for this conversation about reparations where people are open to the idea. And it's not just a kind of a political third rail.
Yeah, I agree. And I have one more saying, please ask this question. And so we'll wrap up here. How would you respond to white Jewish people who would say they had no part in slavery and don't feel responsible for reparations?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I love how, and that might be a comment made by a white Jewish person. It could be a comment made by a white non-Jewish person. It could be made by a recent immigrant. But I love the way that Brian Stevenson approaches this question, and I agree with it. The starting question should be looking at US history, whether you believe in the context of that history, something is owed to the African-American community. Mm-hmm. And once you answer that question, which I think most of us would arrive at yes, I think it's hard not to, then you can have the conversation about, well, what does that look like, right? That pulls us away from a conversation about, this isn't about individual culpability. It's about collective responsibility.
That's right.
Right, for making communities whole. And so that would be my answer.
Thank you so much, Professor Johnson. And so, wow, that time went by really fast. What a fascinating presentation. And thank you for sharing your expertise and your time with us. And, we, to be continued. I think that this is just the beginning of the conversations that we need to have around this topic. And we will be able to have more conversations at some point. And so I think I have a slide that I'd like to share. That was my first slide. Let me find my second one. I still see comments coming in. I'm so excited to be able to continue to have this conversation in a couple of days. I am sorry, my slides are hiding from me right now. I will find them in just a second. Well, I'll just tell you that we have two more sessions coming up, May 16th and May 23rd. We will continue the conversations around reparations. We will talk about more around the history of reparations and then the Jewish perspective on reparations. And those are at 3 o'clock. We have your email addresses and we will be in contact with more information, resources that you can also access as well. I would like to share with you that the Union for Reform Judaism just launched our racial justice campaign, and we have lots of work to do. If you are interested in the advocacy piece, we are focused on the Freedom to Vote Act, which is HR 1 and HR 4, and then we have a ton of things that you can do around what we call our READY pillar: racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And there are opportunities to participate in workshops and trainings and to learn more about the racial equity work that's going on internally and externally. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's our slide, and we will say good night, and we hope to see you on May 16th for our next session on reparations. Good night.